Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ann Kinseth. I'm the Director of Education at the Meadows Museum here in Dallas, Texas. And I'm so happy that you've chosen to join us this afternoon for our virtual talk. This talk is part of our Further Afield series, which provides broader social, political, economic, and historical context for works of art here at the Meadows Museum. So before we get started, just a couple of reminders. The first is that we would prefer if everyone other than our speaker can stay on mute today during our presentation. The second is I do want you all to know that we're recording, and it's our hope that we'll be able to add this to the museum's YouTube channel in the future. And finally, questions. So throughout the presentation, you are welcome to use the chat function to share any questions you may have. At the end, I will share them with our presenter today, and we'll get to them, as many as we can. But also at the end, if it's easier to just unmute to ask your question, there'll be an opportunity to do that as well. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Grace Coolidge. Grace Coolidge is a professor of history at Grand Valley State University in Allendale, Michigan, and her research focuses on women, gender, and the family in early modern Spain. She earned her PhD at Indiana University in 2001, and since then she's published widely, including the 2011 book, Guardianship, Gender, and the Nobility in Early Modern Spain, an essay in the 2014 book, The Formation of the Child in Early Modern Spain, articles in the 16th Century Journal and the Journal of Family, and her most recent book, Sex, Gender, and Illegitimacy in the Castilian Noble Family, 1400 to 1600, was published only last year in 2022. So it's my pleasure to now turn the presentation over to Grace Coolidge for a talk that she has titled Cherishing Children, Childhood and the Noble Family in Early Modern Spain. So welcome, Grace.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Anne, for inviting me and to the Meadows Museum, for inviting me to give the talk, and also for access to their amazing art collection, which I have just really enjoyed working with. And thank you to all of you for being here today. I want to start today with the story of one elite child. In the July heat of 1507, when he was 12 years old, let's make sure I can move my PowerPoint here. Enrique de Guzman became the fourth Duke of Medina Sidonia when his father died unexpectedly of the plague. Enrique's mother had died in childbirth when Enrique was only a year old in 1496, and the baby apparently died also. His older brother had also died, but he had 3 older sisters, as well as a younger half-sister and 4 younger half-brothers from his father's second marriage. At age 12, Enrique was already engaged to be married, and his future brother-in-law, Pedro Girón, became his guardian. This power-hungry aristocrat abused young Enrique, eventually kidnapping him to force him to leave his estate to his wife, who was also Pedro's sister. At age 18, Enrique himself died without having had children. Enrique's story encapsulates some of the challenges faced by noble children in early modern Spain. He was incredibly wealthy, inheriting one of the most important titles in early modern Castile, but he lost his mother, 2 siblings, and his father during his childhood, and was forced into adulthood at the young age of 12 before he had the skills or authority to cope with the adult world. His experience raises questions that I want to explore today. How did the early modern Spanish elite view childhood? Did they value and love their children, or simply see them as proxies for adults, tools to be used by the family to its best advantage? What was childhood like in an age where families were frequently divided by death? How did the nobility allow a 12-year-old to get forced into a title and left to the mercy of a greedy guardian? My goal is to explore the roles and lives of children in elite families, with examples from the monarchy and the nobility, both through written records and the wonderful art collection of the Meadows Museum. My research shows that elite families valued children on multiple levels. Like many of us, they cherished their children and wanted the best for them, But their ideas about childhood and how children should be raised were very different from modern ideas. These families loved, worried about, cared for, and grieved for their children, whom they reared in luxury and with great care. But they also saw their children as important family assets who had a financial and a strategic value. This idea caused them to cut childhood short as they trained children for success in adult roles. The nobility wanted their children to be obedient, loyal to the family and lineage, and successful in their careers and marriages. These expectations sometimes caused conflict in the noble family as parents and children argued about marriage choices, career options, and suitable behavior. My research focuses on the nobility, two of whom you can see here from the Meadows Museum collection, the highest ranking group of people in early modern Spain. This group includes the most powerful noble families who held noble titles, such as Duke, Count, and Marquess. They also owned 97% of the land in Castile, were fabulously wealthy, and had immense political influence. Below this very top rank of the nobility were lower-ranking nobles, younger sons and daughters, untitled noblemen and women, who were usually junior members of the more powerful branches. This is a small group, comprising 2 to 3% of the population of Castile, who wielded immense power. Their position meant that they worried constantly about keeping and expanding their wealth and power, a concern that is reflected in their parenting strategies. The noble family was organized into small units of an immediate family, husband, wife, and children, with each smaller family being part of a larger lineage whose goals they identified with and supported. Historian Alex Mizumoto-Gitter argues that the early modern elite family was, quote, an actively constructed and maintained system with the goal of creating networks of reciprocity based on interpersonal relationships and family ties. Children were important in this hierarchy, and they were seen as investments. They were helped into lucrative positions and prestigious marriages with the idea that these advantages would be beneficial to the whole group. Historian Teresa Ehrenfeit argues that for the Castilian monarchy, children, quote, were the future. They were symbolic promises of dynastic stability and prosperity, and this was also true for the nobility. The immediate family was threatened by instability. Just as today's marriages may end in divorce, with couples remarrying and producing complicated families that included half and step siblings, the early modern Castilian nobility frequently lost partners to death, in battle, from disease, in childbirth. In addition, elite men and some elite women were sexually promiscuous, cheating on their partners and producing children outside of their marriages. This is perhaps the logical outcome of trying to fit human beings into arranged marriages, but it meant that early modern noble families often included step-parents, step-siblings, and half-siblings, some of whom were legitimate and some of whom were not. It also meant that the early modern noble family was surprisingly diverse. Noblemen had children with a wide variety of women, including enslaved women from different backgrounds, and Native American women whom they encountered in the exploration of the Americas. And they recognized and raised many of those children within their families. It is relatively easy to uncover the basic genealogy of a Castilian noble family. It is, however, much harder to know how these people felt about or related to each other. The elite family in early modern Spain produced a broad spectrum of emotions that are conflicting, difficult to categorize, and challenging to uncover. I'm going to use an approach I borrowed from historian Jacqueline Haller, who approached this problem by using what she called accidental documentation of emotional states in Mexican colonial records, in which individuals, quote, report, analyze, and speculate upon feeling in pursuit of other goals. We can catch fleeting examples of emotions in documents that are written for other purposes, wills, marriage agreements, and the entails that passed an estate and title on to the next generation. The emotions captured here are contradictory. They reveal both a ruthless pragmatism with which the nobility dictated their children's futures according to the needs of the family, but they also make it clear that children were valued and important. The nobility loved their children. A good example of this is the first Duke of Medina Sidonia, who had no legitimate children, but 8 illegitimate children with at least 6 different women. In 1457, the Duke created an entail for his son Enrique that would allow Enrique to inherit the bulk of the Duke's goods and his title. The Duke stated in this document what fatherhood meant to him. To love and cherish intensely one's descendants is the most natural inclination, innate to all reasonable creatures, because wise men say that paternal love descends through our species and conquers all other love. He went on to state that he had raised all 6 of his illegitimate children in his own household, and, quote, "It is because I have been near them that I love and cherish them." The Duke's ideas about paternal love are echoed in the famous Castilian law code, the Siete Partidas, which talked about the natural affection that parents have for their children, emphasizing that a father's love, quote, "increases much more by reason of the nurture which he affords his child." This idea that parents would be affectionately attached to their children can also be seen in the artwork of the time, as Saint Joseph and the Virgin Mary are both often portrayed affectionately holding the Christ child. And I think this is interesting. These are 2 beautiful images from the collection, because Joseph is portrayed here too. So you see the role of fathers as well as mothers very prevalently in the artwork of the time. Noble wills also reveal the affection that adults had for children, as well as the wealth of the Castilian nobility. In addition to the main bequests of money and property that noble children were entitled to, the nobility left personal mementos which give glimpses of affectionate relationship. In 1609, the Duchess of Arcos left her granddaughter, Teresa, who was younger than 10, quote, "the pelican with its little chain to be hers." In 1618, the widowed Duchess of Osuna, who had no children of her own, left her niece 4,000 ducados that I would wish were much more for the good company that she has been to me. The wording in these bequests gives us a window into the loving relationships behind them. We can visualize little Teresa admiring her grandmother's jeweled pelican, or the lonely Duchess of Osuna enjoying her niece's company. Parents also worried. Maria de Mendoza, the Marquesa de Cenete, writing her will in 1565, was particularly concerned about her youngest daughter, also named Maria. She asked her eldest son to take care of his siblings if she should die, adding, "Especially I pray that he take charge of Doña Maria because she is a woman and an orphan." Likewise, dying in the middle of winter in 1653, the 7th Marqués de Villena noted in his will that after the salvation of my soul, which like a faithful Christian I hope for at the merciful hand of God, my major care and sorrow are to see the helplessness in which I leave my 2 young children, and to give security to the youthful years of my esteemed darlings, who are the beloved owners and successors to my house. The Marques's concern captures the noble attitudes towards children very well. He was affectionately worried about his esteemed darlings, but he was also concerned for his house or lineage. Parents had reason to worry both about their own untimely deaths and because children were fragile in the early modern period and their lives were precarious. Many families lost multiple children. Some lost all their children, and this reality shaped both parental outlook and children's own experiences. Some babies were stillborn or lived only a few months. Even if they survived infancy, many children lived short lives and lost multiple siblings. Diego Hurtado de Mendoza's eldest son, Pedro, died as a child, quote, "in consequence of a fall that he suffered in the castle in Madrid." And Diego lost another son at age 7. Adolescence brought its own risks, with boys dying at school or as a consequence of their careers in the army. The 3rd Duke of Medina de Rioseco's son, Diego, died at age 18, and the 4th Duke of Infantado lost 2 teenage sons. Alonso was accidentally stabbed to death, and Pedro died while studying at the University of Salamanca. The daughter that Maria de Mendoza was so worried about did die before her mother did. Parents expressed their grief in the language of their wills and in where they chose to be buried. The Marqués de Villena described his daughter Teresa as, quote, "an angel of the saints of God by having died at the age of 3 years." And the 4th Duke of Arcos asked to be buried with "my very dear and beloved son, Luis Ponce de Leon," who had died at the age of 16. So we know that noble children were loved, cherished, worried about, grieved over, and missed. because we can get that information from writings and documents created by their parents. But what was life like for a child? Looking at things from this perspective is more difficult because very young children don't leave written records, but we can uncover some aspects of what a child's life was like during this time period. Early modern elite children lived in luxury at the top of a hierarchy, but also faced serious obstacles and hardships early in their lives. As they got older, they were expected to be active but obedient participants in the family strategy, an expectation which often caused conflict. Excuse me. If we start from birth, most noble children were born at home and baptized shortly after birth. The numerous pictures of the Holy Family that exist from this time give us a sense of how the Castilian elite saw babies, but the result was more complex. So I particularly love this picture of the Holy Family because you can see there's grandmothers and people in the background. Everybody's interested in the baby and looking at the baby. Newborn babies during this time were quickly separated from their noble parents and given to a wet nurse who would feed and look after them. This practice seems strange to modern ears, and it was often dangerous. The nobility valued wet nurses, paying some of them high salaries and sometimes remembering them in their wills years later, but they also bought enslaved women who could perform this service. Some noble children left the family home to live with their wet nurse until they were weaned at about age 2 or 3, but records reveal that noble families were often wealthy enough to bring the wet nurse into their own homes, where they could become a stable part of the noble household. Bernardino de Velasco, the illegitimate son of the first Duke of Frias, lived in a house apart from his father and his legitimate sisters, with a wet nurse who was hired by his father and a tutor who oversaw the household. In contrast, Maria de Mendoza, the fragile daughter of the Marquesa de Cenete, who tragically died before her mother did, had a wet nurse who was hired and supervised by her mother and who lived in the family household with her mother's ladies-in-waiting. The relationship between wet nurses and their noble charges could be a close one. Aldonza de Mendoza developed such a strong bond with her wet nurse that years later, when the adult Aldonza was the Duchess of Arjona, she employed her wet nurse's daughter as her personal maid and left her a legacy in her will. Wet nurses were still very much at the mercy of their noble employers, however. Some wet nurses were free women who received a salary, but some were enslaved women who came from very different worlds and backgrounds than the children they tended. Many wet nurses were separated from their own children, whose lives might be endangered when their mothers had to provide milk for another child. So noble children got their first taste of luxury in their parents' house, where they grew up as the top of a hierarchy, which included a small army of servants and enslaved people. The generous grandmother who gave young Teresa the pelican with its little chain also gave her, along with her sister, the 2 Berber slave women who looked after the little girls. This rich gift emphasized the girls' wealth and privilege, as well as the diversity of the noble household. Even as small children, these girls, quote, owned other people, and those people came from Africa and had probably been born Muslim. We know something about the care of very young elite children from the letters written by the governess of Princess Margarita to the princess's father. Margarita was the daughter of King Philip IV and Queen Mariana of Austria, and you can see Velázquez's portraits of them here. The little princess was born in July of 1651, and she is famous for her portrait by Velázquez titled Las Meninas. So this is one of the very few images I'm using today that doesn't come from the Meadows collection. This painting is in the Prado, but you can see in the middle the little princess, she's the center, and in the background behind her shoulder, you can see her parents, whose portraits we just saw. So here's her parents, and then you can see them in the middle back there, looking in the mirror, watching the princess have her portrait painted. Margarita had several wet nurses and a governess, the Countess of Salvatierra, who supervised her household. By April of 1652, when she was just under a year old, the princess could walk with a baby walker and could visit her parents in their apartments in the royal palace. By January of 1653, about 18 months old, she was beginning to talk and to eat solid food. In March, she was very sick and confined to bed for over 2 months. Recovering, the princess was weaned in November of 1654, aged 3.5. And by the time she was 4, she was dressing up in the elaborate farthingale that grown women wore, and which you can see in the painting. It's that stiff skirt that all the women are wearing, and learning to use the toilet. She loved sweets, and her governess struggled to get her to stop eating the cakes, chocolates, and sugared nuts, which gave her stomach aches. Like her noble peers, by age 5, she was considered a child, no longer a baby, and she began to receive noble visitors and practice skills she would need as an adult woman. As young noble children were weaned and moved from infancy with a wet nurse to childhood in the care of nannies and tutors, most of them acquired siblings. Noble families were often large, as if to compensate for the toll that death took on children. Many noble children grew up in households full of the children of a range of ages. We can catch glimpses of the affectionate relationships that developed through the letters of Philip IV's daughters. Margarita, the younger princess, wrote happily in 1657 that my heart is filled with joy because my sister and I are going to sleep in the same room. And her older half-sister, Princess Maria Theresa, said about Margarita, my sister is growing up very healthy and beautiful. She loves me. The elder children were expected to look after their younger siblings, both as children and later in the adult world. We have already seen the Marquesa de Senete asking her eldest son to take care of her youngest daughter, Maria, if her mother should die before Maria grew up. Many noble fathers also counted on their children to look out for each other. In 1612, the Duke of Frias stated, "Younger brothers depend on the elder, and look to enhancing his authority in the grandeur of his house, so that the elder brother, in turn for so much respect, should always look out for his brothers, always helping and favoring them." The nobility took his words seriously, and childhood affection often transformed into adult sibling support that was especially important for illegitimate children. So the third count of Paredes, whose name was Rodrigo, had 25 children, and he charged his elder son, Pedro, with taking care of his 8 legitimate siblings, 6 legitimate half-siblings, and at least 10 illegitimate half-siblings. In turn, these siblings worked with Pedro to make sure everyone got support. Pedro, up here on the left in red, arranged a marriage for his illegitimate half-brother Jeronimo, over here on the right in red, and their sister Maria Magdalena, down the left corner in red, left Jeronimo's children legacies in her will, which is dated 1587. Another sister, Juana, in the middle there in black, helped by providing an income to their illegitimate half-sister Aldonza, on the right in black, so that she could become a nun in the convent of Santa Spiritus de Alcaraz. The deaths of parents and children could disrupt and reform the noble family in many different ways. Ana de Mendoza, the eldest daughter of the Duke of Infantado, saw 4 brothers and sisters die while she was growing up. With only 3 younger surviving sisters, her childhood was filled with grief and death, and her future irrevocably shaped because without a surviving brother, she inherited the title of Duchess of Infantado in her own right. By 1587, Anna's first husband had died, and her 5-year-old daughter Luisa had thus lost her father, as well as a brother and a sister. Anna remarried when Luisa was 9 and had 2 more daughters, Mariana and Anna, younger half-sisters for Luisa, but Mariana too died at age 12. The little princess Margarita also lost siblings. Her sister Maria Ambrosia was born and died in December of 1655 while Margarita was toilet training and practicing with her farthingale, and 2 younger brothers were born and died within the next few years. The experiences that the nobility had with early death and its subsequent disruption caused them to invest in the idea of lineage, which used land ownership and the careers, alliances, and lives of their surviving children to protect their families into the future and overcome the tragedies that might destroy a single generation. They employed their beloved children to keep the family line going through a series of arranged marriages and carefully constructed careers that parents chose and shaped for their children. At this moment of transition from infancy to adulthood, we can catch a glimpse of another dilemma that early modern parents might face. Some children were unable to make these transitions, leaving families struggling with how to care for disabled children or those who suffered from a chronic illness. A common solution was that instead of an education, these children would receive a guardianship and an allowance for their maintenance. For example, in 1448, the first Count of Arcos disinherited his son Diego, who was disabled in some way. He uses the word demente, which doesn't give me a very clear picture of what the problem was. Instead of an inheritance, the Count left Diego a yearly allowance of 30,000 maravedis to cover his food and clothing, and charged his eldest son, Diego's older brother, to take Diego into his care and make sure he got the allowance and was properly cared for. In comparison, each of Diego's siblings inherited 500,000 maravedis. Likewise, in 1531, Doña Ana de Castilla, concerned about what would happen after her death, left a guardian for her mentally disabled son, and she used the word mentecapto. It's a little bit different. In this case, Doña Ana's son was living in the monastery of Nuestra Señora de Atocha in Madrid, which is the image that you're seeing in the background of the slide there, where presumably he could be safely cared for on a daily basis. Permanent residence in a religious institution, monastery or convent, was a common solution for disabled children in Catholic Europe. Other children and their families worked with disabilities that were perhaps less limiting. Juan Baltasar de Silva inherited the title of Count of Cifuentes while he was still in his teens, but he was vision impaired, so his mother had to oversee the accounts and take an active role in managing his vast estates. All of these children were supported and looked after, although those who were deemed mentally disabled were probably also shut away from public life. The terms used, mentecapto and demente, do not give us a sense of what kind of disability families and children were dealing with, and they probably didn't know what kind of disability they were dealing with. The haunting painting by Goya that I'm showing here gives us a sense of what could be in store for the mentally disabled. But the nobility had the wealth and resources to ensure, if they wanted to, that their children did not end up in this situation. As most elite children moved away from infancy and transitioned to childhood at ages 5 or 6, they began their educations at home with tutors, governesses, and parents all helping to teach them both literacy and the rules for success in the elite adult world. Elite education was very gendered, preparing boys for careers as title holders in the army or in the church, and preparing girls for marriage or the convent. In spite of the gendered nature of the education provided, both boys and girls were taught to read and to write, and subsequently given access to the vast noble libraries. Boys were required to learn the skills needed in the life of a nobleman. A contemporary biographer tells us that in the very early 15th century, 10-year-old Alvaro de Luna, who would later go on to be the confidant and advisor to King Juan II of Castile, knew how to read and write at a level appropriate for a gentleman, and he knew how to ride and to handle a horse well, and to procure clean and suitable clothes, and be very gracious in his speech and countenance. The description is interesting since it gives us a sense of what boys learned in addition to learning to read. Alvaro needed to be a soldier who would fight for the king, but he also needed to be a gentleman who could appear in clean and suitable clothes in the king's court. And you can see some of that in this portrait as Miguel is clearly dressed up for his portrait. This image is Goya's wonderful painting, Students from the Pestalozzian Academy from the Meadows collection. And it shows teenage boys, probably noble boys, being educated. As teenagers, a small proportion of young noblemen, about a quarter to a third, were sent to university, especially if they were preparing for careers in the church. Pedro González de Mendoza, son of the Marqués de Santillana and the younger brother of the first Duke of Infantado, left home in 1422, at age 14, to study rhetoric and history with his uncle, the Archbishop of Toledo. At age 18, Pedro was sent to the University of Salamanca to study canon law, and he went on to become an archbishop and then a cardinal. In contrast, the 16th century writer Juan Luis de Vives wrote that while girls should be taught to read literature, philosophy, and the scriptures, their additional skills should be confined to working with wool and cooking, and their focus should be on chastity. In his work, The Education of a Christian Woman, which he published in 1524, Vives stated, "But in a woman, no one requires eloquence or talent or wisdom or professional skills or administration of the republic or justice or generosity. No one asks anything of her but chastity." Daughters did not attend university, and although a small number of them were educated in convents, most of them remained at home or in the care of a female relative. When the Marquesa de Zahara wrote her will in 1626, she noted that her adolescent daughter Elvira, quote, not having attained her majority, remains in my house. And the Countess of Miranda remained with her mother until she married at age 22 in 1526. Mothers and their libraries therefore played a key role in the education of teenage noblewomen. Spanish noblewomen had a high literacy rate and were often actively involved in teaching their daughters and nieces in both literary and practical ways. Catalina de Silva, mother of the Princess of Eboli, owned 288 books in 1570, and Mencia de Mendoza, who was childless but raised her younger sisters, had a collection of 949 books at her death in 1554. The Countess of Palamos educated her daughter Estefania in domestic tasks, but also taught her how to run a profitable business in silk manufacturing. In spite of vives, noble girls were taught how to manage property, industries, and the other economic assets of the nobility, as well as how to play their roles in the polished literary world of high society and the court. The art at the time reflects an uneasiness with women's roles in education. By the 14th century, there are depictions of both St. Anne and Virgin Mary with books and pens and ink. This underscores the potentially educational nature of the relationship between mother and child, and it provided possible models for ordinary women and their families. However, by the 17th century, in spite of Murillo's famous painting on the subject of St. Anne teaching the Virgin to read, humanist writers tried to present Mary as having learned to read from the Holy Spirit, and were advising fathers to take a more active role in teaching their children. This shift indicates some concern over the appropriate role for women in educating children. Nevertheless, there is abundant evidence that women of the period had a hand in their children's education in the early years for their sons and throughout adolescence for their daughters. The emphasis put on education helps us to see how the early modern Castilian elite perceived childhood. The stages described here show a sense that infancy lasted until a child was about 5, when there was a transition to childhood or youth. Children were then educated for adult roles, which, in a transition that seems abrupt to modern eyes, they might take on as early as ages 12 or 14. As children moved out of the nurturing environment of childhood towards careers and marriages, the hierarchy of the elite family also becomes more apparent. The eldest siblings inherited the family title, made the most prestigious marriages with the biggest dowries, and were trained for the most important careers. In an age of arranged marriages and dowry inflation, younger siblings might not be able to marry, often settling for life as professional soldiers or joining convents or monasteries. The nobility arranged their children's marriages. Personal preference or affection was not an important factor in creating marriages for the next generation. From their point of view, well-arranged marriages enabled parents to pass on the social status, the economic and material resources, and the political offices that they had earned in their lifetimes to their children. If this seems ambitious and profit-oriented to us, perhaps it was. The Castilian nobility had an overwhelming sense of their own importance and place in the hierarchy they lived in, and they perceived a well-arranged marriage as benefiting both the family and the child. Making his will in 1615, the third Duke of Arcos stated that he had already done his duty by his daughter Maria, the Countess of Benavente, because he had endowed her competently with the said 100,000 ducados and married her into such a grand house as the Benavente. While the Dukes of Arcos as a family benefited from a close connection with the Counts of Benavente, the implication here is that the Duke thought Maria herself had benefited by marrying into the wealth and status that she, as a daughter of a Duke, deserved. This attitude makes the young ages of these marriages a little more understandable. Parents scrambled to protect both their children and their families by creating suitable alliances for the future. In 1408, the 10-year-old Marqués de Santillana was formally betrothed to Catalina Suárez de Figuera. The marriage was formalized in 1412, but not consummated until 2 years later when Inigo was 16. Likewise, Ana de Mendoza, Duchess of Pastrana and her father's heiress, was married in 1553 at the age of 12, with the stipulation that the marriage not be consummated until at least 2 years had passed. Anna remained with her parents while her new husband, Ruy Gomez, Prince of Eboli, who was 36, traveled to England and Flanders with Philip II. Summarizing some of the human difficulties of these arrangements, the prince wrote to the Duke of Alba, "They write me that my wife has grown up, but I have grown gray, and I'm afraid that if we go on like this, I won't even be recognized at home." 4 years later, at the age of 16, Anna was pregnant with the couple's first child. In turn, Anna arranged for her own eldest daughter to marry at age 13. Both girls and boys were trained for careers that could be assets to the family, but gender dictated the careers that noble children had access to. Older sons were trained for careers in the army or in diplomatic service. And this is a really fascinating portrait. This is Alessandro Farnese, who is actually an Italian nobleman. He's also the grandson of Charles V of Spain because he is the son of Charles V's illegitimate daughter, Margaret of Austria. So he kind of connects the two cultures, and you can see that he's being portrayed as a potential warrior here. The eldest son used the skills acquired from this kind of an education to fulfill his future role as a title holder. The expectation of military service could shape a boy's childhood and education, and the actual service itself could start at a very young age. We can see this play out across the generations in the family of the Dukes of Arcos. The second Duke of Arcos brought along his 13-year-old son to participate in putting down the revolt of the Alpujarras in 1569. This career choice incorporated a young man into an important masculine tradition in the noble family, but it was also a terrible risk. Another noble, Gomez Gonzalez Butron, lost 3 sons and a grandson in battle in the 15th century. In 1615, the third Duke of Arcos left his young grandsons legacies that revealed the family strategy for their future. The eldest grandson, Rodrigo, received the estate, the title, and, quote, 2 of the best horses that I leave, while his younger brother, Luis, inherited the best and most complete sets of my armor for fighting on foot and on horseback. Rodrigo became the 4th Duke of Arcos, and Luis joined the military. Young noblemen and young noblewomen also spent time at the royal court, training for their future lives as supporters and servants of the crown, and making bonds and alliances with other young nobles. In the early 16th century, the son of the Count of Benevente, 2 sons of the Duke of Medinaceli, a son of the Marqués de Villafranca, and a son of the Count of Santi Esteban del Puerto, were all in service together in the royal court. Noble girls also served at court, where they received expensive educations. Queen Isabel of Castile hired professionals to teach the young ladies of her court to read, write, sing, dance, and play musical instruments. A little later on, the Count of Melito's youngest daughter, Maria, grew up in the imperial court from about age 6. She traveled to France as companion to Queen Leonor of Austria when she was only 8, returning to Spain when she was 18 in about 1540 and ready to be married. The other main career path for young nobles was the church. Staunchly Catholic, the Castilian nobility truly valued church careers as an expression of their religion, but also found them to be a profitable investment in one of the most powerful institutions in early modern Spain. Younger children destined for the church began preparing for this career at an early age. In 1627, Leonor de Guzman told the courts that her son Diego was in training for the church and would receive his first tonsure at age 7. A church career required extensive formal education, a patron, and the money that could pay for a boy's education and provide him with financial support while he studied for the tonsure. In 1662, Joseph Ponce de Leon, the teenage son of the 4th Duke of Arcos, was studying at the University College in Cuenca in preparation for entering the University of Salamanca, where he would complete his studies to become a priest. 7 of his brothers and a younger sister had died during his childhood. His father had died in 1658, and his mother was dying in 1662. In her will, the dying duchess fretted about young Joseph, asking her brother, Cardinal Pascual de Aragon, to take special care of him because he would be, quote, abandoned on her death. I would die desolate if I did not have the assurance that I do, that you will care for him with much kindness, she wrote to her brother. The Duchess's words and the situation of the Arcos family give insight into the pressure the nobility felt to get even very young children well started on careers before death wreaked havoc on their family support systems. Young women could also have successful careers in the church, which usually cost less than providing them with a marriage dowry. Young girls needed a convent dowry, the means to furnish their cell, a gratuity to celebrate their formal entrance ceremony, and a pension to support them during the year of their novitiate. In exchange for this investment, parents knew that their daughters had a secure home and support for life, and some girls rose to important and influential positions in the church. The first Duke of Arcos had two younger sisters who were abbesses, and when Leonor de Mendoza, illegitimate daughter of the Marqués de Santillana, joined the convent of Santa Clara in Guadalajara before 1455, her aunt, also an illegitimate daughter, was already the abbess. By 1480, Leonor herself had risen to the position of abbess, which she held at least until 1499. Families felt that their daughters would be safe in convent careers. Historian Elizabeth Layfelt argues that aristocratic women used convents to create a quote type of familial home that could demonstrate their pride in lineage and family ties. Many aristocratic girls entered a convent that was already full of their female relatives, a fact that doubtless helped their transition away from home life. For example, in the late 15th century, Beatriz Manrique, daughter of the first Count of Osorno, professed as a nun in the convent of Santa Clara de Carrion. Several years later, her nieces, Maria and Beatrice, joined her there, and then their niece, Antonia, who was illegitimate, followed them into the convent, later becoming the abbess. While convent careers were safe, prestigious, and religiously meaningful both to the children who undertook them and to their parents, it is also true that they were financially advantageous to noble families. Children's careers in the church were often designed to consolidate family resources. The nobility focused on a multi-generational strategy, and the extended family often dictated life choices for children. In spite of parental expectations that children would do as they were told, this did not always go smoothly. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI sent his 16-year-old illegitimate son Juan from Rome to Valencia to assume the title of Duke of Gandia. Emphasizing that Juan was in many ways still a child, the anxious Pope wrote to him about what to wear and how to behave, reminded him to visit his aunt when he arrived, and gave him detailed instructions on how to manage his money. But the teenage Juan now had to quickly assume an adult role. Juan's older brother, Pedro Luis, had been a war hero fighting for the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabel. In return, the monarchs had given him the dukedom of Gandia and arranged a marriage for him with their cousin. When Pedro Luis died suddenly in 1488, the family could not afford to lose these lucrative prizes, so both the engagement and the dukedom were given to Juan. Juan, however, did not cooperate. Reports soon reached his father that in Valencia, Juan was gambling away his money, hunting dogs and cats in the street for sport, and refusing to sleep with his new wife. His actions threatened the complicated family arrangements that the Pope had made to establish his son as a prestigious Spanish duke, a post which would benefit the entire family. Both the Pope and Juan's elder half-brother delivered strong scoldings by mail to the errant Juan. Arranged marriages were one of the family strategies that often ran into human complications. The second Count of Arcos took one look at his new bride and decided that he liked her lady-in-waiting better. His offended wife left him, although she could not divorce him, and the Count settled down with the woman he preferred, Leonor Nunez, with whom he had 9 children, all of whom had to be painstakingly legitimated in later life. Noble parents scolded, insisted, and sometimes disinherited their wayward children. When Diego Lopez Pacheco de Silva married Maria Davalos without his parents' permission, his parents disinherited him, even though he was their eldest son and heir, and Maria was a noblewoman. If we come back to the story of Enrique, the 12-year-old Duke of Medina Sidonia, who we saw at the beginning of the talk, we can explore the somewhat contradictory noble attitudes towards childhood further by examining what happened after Enrique died childless at the age of 18. You'll remember his greedy brother-in-law, Pedro Girón, Enrique's guardian, who abused Enrique and forced him to write a will in which he left his estate to his young wife, who was also Pedro's sister. This was illegal, but Pedro Girón attempted to make it work by claiming that Enrique's father's second marriage to Leonor de Guzman was illegal, and his younger half-brother Alonso, who should have had the title, was illegitimate. Leonor, Enrique's stepmother, mounted a fierce legal battle for her teenage son's rights and also arranged a marriage for him with the illegitimate granddaughter of King Ferdinand. The king took Leonor de Guzman's side in this battle, forcing Pedro Girón to withdraw his troops from the young duke's property. The married Alonso duly became the fifth Duke of Medina Sidonia after Enrique had died. We can see here children used as pawns in the family strategy, as teenage Alonso was forced into a role that, it turns out, he was unable to handle. Alonso made a ceremonial entry into Seville as the new duke, and then came to court to meet his bride and consummate his marriage. But in 1516, he was declared, quote, mentally disabled, lacking judgment and natural sense. His marriage was annulled by the church for non-consummation, and his bride handed over to his younger brother, Pedro. Enrique and Alonso were both forced into adult roles too soon. Neither succeeded in becoming effective male leaders or having children of their own to inherit the estate. Neither was protected by parents or grandparents from abuse by other nobles or from having to take on these roles. Alonso, it seems, was actually disabled and therefore not able to take on an adult role at all. His mother's fierce fight to have him declared duke benefited the lineage much more than it benefited him. The Castilian nobility cherished, loved, and worried about their children, but their concern and affection played out in ways that are not always easily recognizable to us today. Faced with high death rates, an uncertain future, a desire for power, and competition with other nobles, the Castilian elite made decisions to protect their families that seem strange to modern eyes. The disabled Alonso was forced into a title and a marriage that he could not handle, but when the crisis was over, the marriage was dissolved and the title shifted to another child. Alonso lived another 25 years, during which time his brother handled the estates and responsibilities of the dukedom, and someone cared for Alonso until his death. Faced with the harsh world of competition and struggle, with no safety net and no guarantee for the future other than what they could win for themselves, the Castilian nobility coped by simultaneously caring for their children and demanding much of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Grace. That was fantastic and fascinating. And we already have some questions in the chat box, but I'd like to start with just a compliment that came through. Someone just thanks you so much for using the Meadows Museum collection because it really helped them better understand or grow their understanding of the works in the galleries. So thank you so much. So what I'd like to do is start with the questions in the chat box. And then if we have time when we get through those, I'll invite people to unmute should you have a question there. So starting off, Maria Pilar is wondering if you have any points of comparison between how Spain approached childhood and parenthood versus other countries in Western Europe. I don't know if you know anything about how France did things or England.
I think it's quite similar, especially when you compare the nobilities in those different countries. So the Tudor nobility, for example, also married children off at very early ages, pushed them toward careers in the church if that was considered to be a good idea. And the French nobility also did that. And the Italian and the Spanish nobility intermarried and were very interchangeable. You saw that picture of Alessandro Farnese that the Meadows collection has. And so some of them intermarried with the Castilian nobility that I'm actually discussing. So the elite attitude towards child raising, I think, is very similar in Spain and across Europe. Guardianship practices are similar, and there's also a lot of illegitimacy, I know, in all of those nobilities. And again, the illegitimate children often serve as that backup heir. They're recognized and taken into the family, and that's true also across Europe. The inheritance laws are a little bit different, but I think the social practices are very similar.
Thank you. So this is a question from Laura Martin. She is wondering if you found evidence in the written archive. So you mentioned like wills, things like that, that noble families used the Holy Family as a behavioral model. Laura says that you mentioned this a little when discussing children's educations and the depiction of the Virgin Mary learning to read, and is wondering if you could speak a little more to this.
Yes, that's a great question. There's some great work by Charlene Villasenor Black, who's an art historian, and she wrote about Joseph as a father. She's got a wonderfully, lavishly illustrated book that I think includes some of the Meadows Museum paintings. It's possible. And she talks about that shift where, in the ways that Joseph is portrayed, and they follow the shifts in social masculinity. So Joseph starts out as sort of subservient. He helps Mary and he does things that women might normally do. And then clearly that's worrying somebody after a little while. And so he gets a little bit buffer and a little bit more masculine as the art changes. So I don't find evidence for that in the wills and things like that. But you can find evidence for it both in the literature and the art at the time. And it does seem that the noble family's portrayal in art shifted as the social pressures on the nobility shifted. So as we get into the 17th century, and Spain doesn't need a warrior nobility class as much as they had in the earlier times. They get worried about masculinity and anxious about men, and then you can see the portrayal of Joseph beginning to shift and change. So yeah, I would highly recommend Charlene Villasenor Black. Her book really helps with that. That's a great question. Thank you so
And
much.
I'll have to do a little plug that Charlene, she did one of these further afield lectures for us. So you can always check the museum's YouTube channel
Perfect.
to watch that. So the next question is from Maria Lahiri, and she notes that today, in 21st century society, the idea of privacy for children is important, not just socially, but also legally. So she is wondering if there were any ideas about kind of rights to privacy, if this was something that was in play at all during this time period.
That is such a great question because it's such a contrast. Privacy was not only not available for children, it really wasn't available for anybody in this time period. And you can see it in the architecture also. So as you tour castles or palaces or look at their floor plans in this time, you'll see that they don't have any hallways. The rooms all lead from one into another. So nobody is having any privacy. Everybody's walking through everybody else's space to get to them. People are sharing beds. And some of the deaths that are happening of very young children are because they're sharing a bed and they get smothered or get lain on by a wet nurse or a family member. So there isn't a concept of privacy or even a sense that that's something desirable. And I think that's one of the things that makes them the most different from us. We may not always achieve the privacy we want, but we at least try. These folks are not even interested in privacy. They're very focused on the lineage and the group and promoting the family. And I would argue that that is partly a result of those high death rates, that you can't invest too much in one individual that you might lose. It makes more sense to invest in a family, a team, where there's a kind of a backup player. And I think that affects ideas about privacy and about choice. I think many of these children are pushed into marriages or careers because that's what's good for the family, not because that's what they seem to be good at themselves. And sometimes that works out and sometimes it doesn't.
Thank you. So this will be our last question from from the chat box. Maria just thanks you for your answer. But the last question before I open it up to anyone who would like to unmute. So this is a question from Nancy. Would you be able to elaborate more on what dowry inflation entailed?
Yeah. So in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, as these noble families are competing, and this is true in Spain and also in Italy, and not as much in France and England, although to a lesser degree it's true there too. The noble families begin to social climb through their daughters' marriages. And so they start diverting more family assets to the dowry, and dowries start to grow, which means then the next family, in order to compete, has to grow their daughter's dowry, and the next family has to grow their daughter's dowry until finally a later Duke of Gandia, who had 6 daughters, went bankrupt trying to provide dowries for all of them, because it became very socially problematic. If a daughter married down into a family that was lower, that lowered everybody's prestige. Whereas if a daughter married up, it could raise everybody's prestige. It meant positions for her brothers and connections that would be good for them. But it became really problematic, and I ran short of time and I cut my example, but I do have an example of one family who they had 4 children. The eldest son inherited the title. The daughter went into a convent and she signed an agreement saying that if she died without children, which of course she would do as a nun, her portion of the inheritance, her dowry, would come back to the family. And then the 2 other brothers also became monks. So everybody's inheritance went back to the eldest son, and those children probably got no choice at all. They had to be in a convent because the marriage dowries had simply become too expensive to afford. There's some really good work done on that in Italy about dowry inflation. There's some in Spain too, but there's just some really excellent social history in Italy about that. So you might pursue that there if you're interested.
Okay. I think all of our questions have been answered very thoroughly. So thank you so much for this really wonderful presentation this afternoon for us in Dallas, and it's been a real treat to have you with us. So thank you so much, Dr. Coolidge.
Thank you all very much for coming. I appreciate it. It's fun to share something I love so much. So
yes, and thank you all for coming.